So I'm going to give you a brief overview of native pollinators. I know some of the folks later on are going to talk more about plants for pollinators and other management for pollinators. I'm an entomologist, so I focus on insect pollinators, but there are other animals that pollinate as well, which we'll talk briefly about. Okay. We'll figure it out. Okay. I'm just going to cover why we should care about pollinators to begin with. And then we'll talk a little bit about broadly types of pollinators before focusing a little more narrowly on bees. Yeah, it's not working. That's all right. We'll just stand a little closer to here. Okay, so in terms of pollination and pollinators, I always step back a little bit because I think in order to understand what's a pollinator and why we should care about pollinators, we have to talk briefly about pollination. This is a little bit of plant biology 101. But anyone know what these light yellow structures are?
Anthers.
Yeah, anthers. And what do they produce?
Pollen.
Yeah, exactly. And what's this glistening, sticky structure? Stigma. Yeah. And that's where the pollen needs to go, right? So the pollen needs to go from the anthers to the stigma. Some flowers have both. Some have just anthers. Some have just stigmas. And in that case, the pollen has to travel further. And so pollinators move the pollen from the anthers where it's produced to the stigma. Again, sometimes that happens within a flower. Sometimes it happens across flowers on the same plant, flowers on different plants. And as a result of that, we can get fertilization. If pollination happens correctly, we get fertilization and then subsequent fruit and seed set, which if we're in agriculture, we care about the fruit and seed for our own consumption, but it's also how the plant reproduces, right? It needs to produce seed. So lots of animals can move pollen, but some are more effective than others, which we'll talk briefly about. It's also important to note that wind and water and even agitation and gravity can do this. And for most plants, it's kind of a combination. They're going to get some pollination from animals, some from wind, some from agitation. And there might be many different animals that can pollinate. Anyone know what flower this is? It's not a crop we have here in Florida. It's an apple. There are, apparently, I've looked into this because I'm an apple connoisseur. There are only 2 states of the entire 50 that don't have a U-pick apple orchard. Florida and Hawaii. So, yeah. In terms of the contribution of these insect pollinators, or we could broaden this out to all animal pollinators, but in terms of their contribution to agriculture, various studies have tried to quantify this. Of the approximately 115 top global crops, about 87 benefit from animal pollination. If we look at the number of hectares or acres, it's about 35% of crop production worldwide. And then my lab did a study recently, and we found that about 43% of all Florida crops are insect pollinated to some extent. A lot of these, if you take insects out of the picture, you'll still get some yield, but it will be diminished. Crops that don't require insect pollination are cereal crops. A lot of vegetables where we're not consuming the fruit or seed, so leafy greens, things like that, we don't need pollinators for production. This is a map of those pollination services. So the counties that are darker red have a greater dependence on insect pollinators. There are counties that produce a lot of blueberries, strawberries, and other fruits and vegetables. Counties that are lighter either don't have as much agriculture, some of these are going to be more urban, or have agriculture that is not dependent on insect pollinators. Pasture, for example, not dependent on insect pollinators. But I also want to point out that we need pollinators for plant diversity and natural systems. A lot of these flowering plants depend on insect pollinators. It's estimated that about 87% of all flowering plants rely on insect pollination. So without insect pollinators, we'd have quite diminished diversity. So again, any animals that can visit flowers can act as pollinators. So we have bees, we have other insects, including things like thrips. A lot of these insects, especially thrips, beetles, can be both deleterious and beneficial. They can act as both pests and pollinators. We also have birds and bats, so larger bodied pollinators. In more temperate and subtropical climates, insects, and in particular bees, tend to be the dominant pollinators. In places like Central America, you have a lot of hummingbird pollination, and in the tropics, you have more bat pollination. But especially here in Florida, we really depend on insects and in particular bees. So I'm briefly going to talk a little bit about differences in pollinators that I think will hopefully help you understand how we can manage them and how we can manage them in solar. So when we talk about bees, one of the things that's really unique about them is that as a group, they're the only group that relies on, with very few exceptions, pollen and nectar for their entire lifespan. They don't consume anything else as both larvae and adults. Some exceptions would be honeybees. You'll occasionally see them sipping sugar from a fruit that has the skin kind of exposed. But for the most part, across the board, they eat pollen and nectar for their entire lifespan. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but we have both social and solitary bees, which is really important to keep in mind. Not all bees are social, but all bees are central place foragers, meaning the female will establish her nest, and then she forages around that nest for her entire lifespan. Unlike butterflies that can lay eggs here and lay eggs there and move on and maybe migrate, bees as adults stay in one spot. They're very local. They provision their offspring. Again, this is different than a lot of other insects that just lay eggs and move on. They feed their young. And so they're going to be collecting that pollen and nectar to feed their young as well as feed themselves. And they typically have pollen carrying hairs, again, because they're collecting it for their offspring. They're not just feeding themselves. There are a lot of flower visiting wasps that can act as pollinators. These wasps differ from bees in that they're carnivorous as larvae. So they have different feeding patterns as the larva, the grub stage, versus the adult. As the adult, they'll feed on nectar. I want to point out that wasps do include yellow jackets and hornets. I often get that question a lot. Are they wasps? Yes. But like bees, wasps are both social and solitary. So the examples I listed there, yellow jackets and wasps, are social. They kind of give wasps a bad rap because they're more aggressive. But there's lots of solitary wasps that don't have big colonies, that are not very aggressive, including a lot of the flower visiting wasps. Like bees, they're central place foragers and provision their offspring. So they'll stay more locally and they feed their babies. But they feed their babies insects and arthropods because they're carnivorous as larvae, so they don't collect pollen and nectar to feed their babies. And there's a lot of variation in wasps, but I highlighted the ones that will typically visit flowers. We also have flower visiting flies. Again, not all flies readily visit flowers, but many of them do, including hoverflies or syrphid flies. We also have mosquitoes that will occasionally visit flowers for nectar. Like wasps, these flies feed on other insects and arthropods as larvae, so they have different feeding behaviors in that grub stage compared to the adult stage. As adults, though, they can feed on nectar. Solitary, we don't have big colonies, right? Not central place foragers. And they don't provision their offspring. So again, the ones that provision their offspring, they generally tend to stay in one spot. They have their nests. They go back and forth to the nest to feed their young. Flies, on the other hand, don't feed their young. They don't have a central nesting site. They move around. How far they move will probably depend on their body size and other aspects of their biology. And just in terms of differentiating some of these bee mimics, the ones that look most like bees have large bulging eyes that cover the whole head. And then they have kind of short stubby antennae, unlike bees. They also only have one pair of wings instead of two pairs of wings, but that's a little harder to see when they're flying around. But those are some ways that you can tell. As the name suggests, some of these bee mimics, hoverflies, will also hover over flowers, and that's unique from bees as well. So if you see something hovering, relatively little, not quite so hairy, bulging eyes, short antennae, it's probably a fly. And then finally, butterflies and moths, which can also act as pollinators, are herbivorous for the most part, or entirely. Are there any examples of non-herbivorous? There's some examples. Oh, there's one. Okay, yeah. Now I'm saying entirely when you're talking about insects, right? Mostly herbivorous, meaning they don't, unlike flies and wasps, they don't feed on other insects or arthropods, but the caterpillar, the larva stage, feeds on non-nectar and pollen plant matter, so other types of plant matter. And then as adults, they feed on nectar. So again, bees are the only ones that feed entirely on nectar and pollen. Like flies, solitary, right? No big colonies. They don't provision their offspring, and so they're not central place foragers. So like flies, they'll lay eggs here and there. They don't return to provision their offspring. The offspring have to fend for themselves. They have to find their own food. So to summarize, bees are unique in that they're the only group that primarily feeds on or exclusively feeds on nectar and pollen throughout their entire life. They provision their offspring. Wasps also do this, but they're unique from insects like flies and butterflies in that they provision their offspring. And they provision their offspring pollen and nectar, so they're uniquely adapted to be collecting that pollen. So they have pollen collecting hairs and large structures on their legs for collecting pollen. And so they're really good pollinators because of all of that. That's not to say that those other insects aren't good pollinators too, but bees tend to be highly effective. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about bees, but again, keeping in mind that many of those other insects will pollinate as well. This is something to keep in mind for wasps. I mentioned that both wasps and bees have both social and solitary species. The majority of bees are solitary. Many wasps are solitary as well. And so what this means is there's no division of labor or reproduction. I describe it as each female is a single mom. She has her own nest. She's provisioning her offspring. And all those offspring, those female offspring, will grow up and have their own babies. This is important to note because these solitary bees and wasps tend to be non-aggressive. They can sting, but they tend to be very non-aggressive. They don't have large colonies to protect. And it's often those social ones that make people afraid of all of these insects, even though most of them are very unaggressive. Many of them nest below ground, which was highlighted in the previous talk, and estimated about 70%. They either nest in deep tunnels or shallow cavities. Only about 30% nest above ground, either excavating their own nests or using pre-existing cavities. Anyone know of an example of a bee that excavates its own nest? Carpenter. Yeah, carpenter bee, right?
Come to my house.
Yeah, you can go see them at Charlottetown. So carpenter bees will dig into wood to build their own nests, but others use pre-existing cavities. So the honeybee is probably the bee that comes to mind most readily, but it's not native. It's not native to the US, it's native to somewhere. It's native to parts of Europe and Asia. In the US, we have a single species of honeybee, Apis mellifera. There are other species of Apis worldwide, but this is the only one we have here in the US. And it exists in Florida in both managed and feral colonies. It is social, and it has perennial colonies, so they're big colonies that live for many years. And they're generalists. But many of the bees that we have here in Florida exhibit different characteristics or traits. There are about 325 species of bees in Florida. Some of those are also not native, but the majority are native. Probably at least 300 of these are native species. I'm not going to cover all of these, but I'll just briefly point out some of the more common groups that are underlined here. These are a couple common bees. This is a sweat bee that's pretty common here in Florida, and a bumblebee. So the longhorned bees, this is a group that is relatively common depending on what plants you're looking at. They tend to be found on the sunflower plant family, Asteraceae, and then there are some that are specialists of cucurbits, including some that specialize on squash. And they're named for the long antennae that are found in the males. So here's a male here with relatively long antennae. The females have really chunky, hairy legs for the most part. So this is an example of a female here as well as a female here. So again, if you have a lot of Asteraceae plants in a solar habitat or other habitat, you'll likely find these bees, including the males with the long antennae. These are all nesters, below ground nesters, and also all solitary. Sweat bees are a really big, diverse group. Some are social, many are solitary, many nest below ground, some nest above ground. So a real diversity of biology and behavior. These are some of the most common species. This is one that's a little smaller than a honeybee, often mistaken for a honeybee. It's very common on plants like Coreopsis, blanket flower. You'll almost certainly see it in your yard or in any planting with flowers. Halictus coyi, well, small to medium-sized sweat bee. We also have a brilliant green sweat bee, Agapostemon splendens, which is very common as well. And then bees that are smaller bodied. This picture doesn't really do that justice, but these bees are just a little bit larger than a large ant. And many of them are gray. This one species has a tan abdomen, but they're quite common as well. We have leafcutter bees, a good number of leafcutter bees here in Florida. They're unique from some of the other bees in that they collect pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So you can see all of those hairs there on the underside of the abdomen. And they also cut leaves to make their nests. These bees are all solitary, like the longhorned bees that I first presented. These are all solitary, so no social colonies. And they primarily nest above ground, but some species nest below ground as well. Then we have the carpenter bees, Cheryl's favorite. So these excavate nests in wood. There's two species here in Florida. This species here, and then this species here. These are the females of the species. Males for this species look quite similar. And then males of the southern carpenter bee are what, when people say, I saw this crazy bee, it's 9 times out of 10, it's the male of the southern carpenter bee. So it is, see if I can find a picture for you if we have time, but it's metallic, blue, green, has orange hairs, bulging eyes. It's very striking. So if you see a big bee and you're like, that's a crazy bee, it's probably the male southern carpenter bee. This is the eastern carpenter bee. Again, they nest in wood, they excavate their own nests. They're probably the only bee that could be considered a pest, other than maybe honeybees, which are non-native and can be aggressive. These bees could be considered a pest because of that excavating in wood behavior. But they tend to focus on soft wood. We don't have a lot of structures that are built exclusively of soft wood here in Florida. But if you go into parts of like Georgia and Appalachia, they're a little bit more of a problem. And then bumblebees, we have 5 species in Florida, including the common eastern bumblebee and the American bumblebee. I think I had an American bumblebee on the first slide. And then this is Bombus impatiens here, the eastern bumblebee. Those are the 2 most common. They are a little different than carpenter bees, just visually in that they're hairier. They have hairs covering the whole body, but they're about similar size. And these bees are social. So these are some of the only native social bees we have, but their colonies are much smaller than honeybee colonies, and they tend to be less aggressive. And they're great pollinators for solanaceous and ericaceous crops, things like tomatoes and blueberries. I think that is my last slide. Yes. So hopefully I have time for some questions. But I didn't go. Hopefully I didn't go through that quick. I cannot stay for the round table, no. But yeah. So if you have questions, ask me now. I'm sorry. I have a sick child at home, and my husband's been on duty since 8 something, so I should probably go relieve them. Yes.
I have a basic question.
Yeah.
Do bees actually eat pollen? Is there like we show that they ingest?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So bees eat pollen, and I think, you know, it used to be thought that primarily they ate pollen as larvae. So the female would collect the pollen and bring it back and give it to the baby. But we found that a lot of those adult bees that are visiting flowers, we knew they would sip on nectar. We found that they're actually consuming quite a bit of pollen as well as adults. How much pollen they consume as adults varies a little bit depending on the species. But the adults will visit, they'll sip some nectar, they'll eat a little pollen. And then in that larval stage, the grub stage, they're really eating the pollen. They're growing, right? They're in that growth stage. So they have to use that pollen, that's their protein source. Yeah, sure.
I've been told by beekeepers that the honeybee will actually travel like a couple miles. Okay, so that's still considered.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so honeybee foraging ranges can be quite variable depending on what's in the landscape. But they've been found to forage, I believe, up to 10 kilometers. So that's like 6 miles. But those maximum distances aren't necessarily the typical distances. So we usually say at least 1 kilometer, you can probably expect them to forage. And then bumblebees will also forage up to 1 kilometer. They've been found to forage up to 5 kilometers. The larger bodied and social bees will forage further. Some of the smaller bees, like the small sweat bees that I said are barely larger than an ant, they forage only 100 to 500 meters from the nest. So when you think about,
aggressive, because up north, get stung by sweat bees.
Yes, yeah. I've also gotten stung by sweat bees. If you know they're on you when you're sweaty, they're attracted to sweat, and they also can sting repeatedly. So it might just be a single individual that is stinging repeatedly. I had one stuck kind of at the back of my knee when I was biking, and every time I made a rotation, I was like, "What is that?" And it was a little sweat bee. So they're not terribly aggressive, but because they're attracted to sweat, they might be on you and you might be, you know, if they're in your elbow or your knee and you're doing something like this, yeah.
Good.
All right, well, you'll hear more about the pollinators too later.